Well, as the ongoing recounts and court challenges go forward in the presidential election, I thought I'd kind of drop back a little bit and address the big issue that underlies it, which is the issue of election fraud. Um, and the problem of dealing with election fraud, particularly in the aftermath of an election, particularly a presidential election. In a First of all, let me make the following thought. Election fraud is best prevented before it happens, because after it happens, it becomes a much more contentious situation. Let's imagine a scenario in which one side has benefited by the fraud and the other side has been hurt by the fraud. But the side that's benefited will obviously seize the moment and say, well, we've won the election, so that we don't need to look any further. And then they're going to give the perception, if they lose the court battles, that somehow it was taken from them, even though they're the ones that are doing the bad deeds. And that's kind of the problem that certainly we're faced in the Trump situation. Add to the fact that this is a presidential election. If this was simply an election to a House seat, for instance, or even for that matter, a Senate seat, I think it'd be much easier for a process to drag this out and have time to properly investigate all the allegations in detail. I'm forgetting the name of the individual, but there was a congressman that was elected to a House seat in North Carolina in 18, who apparently had a staffer who engaged in a small amount of vote harvesting. I'm not even sure if it was a very significant amount. And I don't know if he actually in any way influenced or altered what the votes were on the ballots to any great extent. But whatever he did, it violated the election law in North Carolina, and that ended up ultimately in his election being voided, and a new election was subsequently called. Somebody else got the seat. I think it didn't change parties, however, but that particular individual was out. So that shows you that sometimes these challenges can be effective, and the law will be upheld, especially if a Republican does something wrong. But nevertheless, I'm not advocating what that individual did, although apparently vote harvesting is rampant and legal in, say, California, and has decided several elections. So we have a very uneven system, I guess, in the country nationwide, with each state doing its own things. And at the present moment, rumors are so rampant, it's hard for somebody who even follows this stuff as well as I do to say definitively what the situation is. For instance, I've heard a statement that something to the effect that vote harvesting was legal in Georgia. It is? And the legislature allowed it? I don't know. I really don't know. I heard that. Is that true? I've also heard and read stories that, in fact, ballots that had been improperly, I guess the absentee ballot, the information that had been improperly filled out, were actually taken out and to people that had submitted them and got them fixed by those people, that they actually took the trouble to do that. Now, is that true, or is that another rumor? I don't know. But it gives you the idea of the kind of thing that's out there at the moment. And I would say that, for instance, in that case, I'm sure that it depends on who they voted for, whether or not that was effort was taken, right? And this gets on to issues about accounting glitches in the software that did the accounting, a variety of issues. But the point you get back to is, if you're going to have a fair and well-managed election, you need to take care of it before the election occurs. The safeguards need to be in place ahead of time. But look at the failure of the Supreme Court to not rule effectively on the situation in Pennsylvania. They could have simply ruled at that time to stay the order of the state Supreme Court to allow 3 more days for ballots to come in, and then there would not be time for postal people to change the dates on the ballots that were coming in afterwards, so they would get mixed in with those that came in on time, and all this invalid voting would never have occurred. It just gives you another example of the kind of thing that keeps going on in this subject. And this is why the Democrats need to be held accountable, and why Kayleigh McEnany was absolutely correct in what she was said yesterday before she was interrupted by on the Fox News Cavuto show. And I'm not sure whether we really should blame Fox News for that, or we should blame Cavuto, because I do think that the hosts do seem to have a degree of control over their own shows. And even that, the production people behind each show are probably different people. So a similar thing happening on a, say, a Tucker Carlson show probably wouldn't have happened. So, but I think that needs to be understood too. But what she said is very critical here. The Democrats have consistently tried to allow changes in the processes so that fraud is more possible. And the question is, if you don't intend to facilitate fraud, why are you trying to make it more possible? It just doesn't seem to be a truthful thing. I mean, after all, for instance, to do all sorts of things in ordinary life, you have to have an ID. To go in an airport, fly on an airplane, you have to have an ID. If you're young, I mean, you need to have an ID to buy any alcoholic beverage. There's a lot of things, in addition to driving a car, and so forth. So is it really too burdensome that everybody have an ID and be able to present it before voting? I don't see that it is. But that seems to be a major objective of the Democrats, to eliminate voter ID and to fight against it. This is the other ideas that seem to always be thrown into effect, where you try to create these situations where fraudulent ballots are possible. The other thing I would point out is, too, you get into the issue of the paper mail-in ballot situation. I mean, absentee ballots have a purpose, and that is for people who, for some reason, can't actually come to the polls to vote. And that if they're on business travel, if they're ill, or maybe if they're too infirm to go out. But this also puts a major risk out there that something improper will happen. And then we're dealing with paper ballots that come in, and that leads to a lot more human handling and a possibility for a little skullduggery to occur. So what we really need in this country, which is going to be hard to get, is to go back to primarily voting in person and using systems where the votes are tabulated, I think, electronically. There is always a possibility of software issues, but I do think that the bigger issue is human handling and mishandling of ballots. And there needs to be greater control in making sure that there is real bipartisan, or even for that matter, multi-partisan, if there's more people running, observers and watching the process and making sure that people aren't doing improper things. Let's face it, this whole conflict right now in the courts and in the public would not be occurring if the Democrats hadn't gone out of their way to obscure the processes. They act like they're cheating, and that is undisputed. Are they really cheating? I think so. And I'm sure a lot of liberals out there in the world think they're not, or at least they say that. But the point is, they act like they are. And that in itself is very suspicious. Add to the fact, again, that Joe Biden did say that his campaign had the greatest voter fraud operation of any campaign ever, or something to that effect. I mean, the exact words. But, I mean, was he misspeaking? Was he trying to say that he was trying to prevent voter fraud? And what voter fraud was he worried about? I mean, I haven't heard of any major issues of Republican voter fraud. I mean, to any significant extent. It's always been a concern well before the election from the Republican side, and was not very much of a concern for the Democrat side. So anyway, that's my thought, that essentially to prevent voter fraud from being successful, it best be done before it happens. And right now we're in the problem of where it has happened, and we're struggling to prove it. And again, the problem there is the word proof. We have a lot of anecdotal evidence that's occurred. We have a variety of affidavits coming in, but it's going to be hard to establish that the fraud was sufficiently large that it actually changed the outcome of the election. And that's the big chinning bar that Trump is fighting against. And we're with him 100% on this effort. But the other problem is the clock. The clock is running fast, and the clock can run either way. The clock can run against Biden if, in fact, the situation is uncertified and he doesn't get 270 electoral votes when they're counted in Congress, simply because the states have not been able to certify. However, if the courts basically rule that the objections are insufficient and that the certification goes forward, the certification will go forward, and that will elect Joe Biden president, right or wrong. And that's why the court battle is probably going to come down to a Supreme Court decision on whether or not to stop the process or not, assuming that Trump can get the process actually fully engaged, which is at the lower court levels, he's continuing to be being rebuffed, and that's kind of our situation at the moment. There is one slight glimmer of good news, and that is that Joe Manchin has come out and publicly declared that he will not support ending the filibuster or packing the Supreme Court. And in fact, you can't pack the Supreme Court without ending the filibuster. The second issue I think that's occurred is on the House side, and that is that it looks like the Republicans have won a fair number of seats, which may even put the Pelosi speakership in jeopardy. We might end up with a different Democrat than Pelosi. We could hope. But it may be, remember, the court packing effort also requires the House side to vote for it. And if they can't get their simple majority to increase the number of seats on the court, that might also fail. And I think there's a fair chance the Republicans will win the 2 seats in Georgia. After all, the Republican vote was higher than the Democrat vote in the election, even though it's tilting the way it is right now in the Trump versus Biden race. Probably because, of course, in that case, the fraudulent votes may have voted for the president and not gone down ticket as much. But at any rate, there's a serious. I think that's something that I think that it's also harder, I think, to turn out the Democrat vote in a special election of that sort because the presidential election has a lot more hype to it, and it is almost 2 months away now. So, at any rate, that's so again, it may well be that we'll avert a true constitutional disaster here, but be wary and I would recommend anybody that has the resource to do so to contribute to the Senate campaigns in Georgia for the 2 Republicans, because winning those seats would be very helpful in preventing a lot of bad stuff from happening to this country in the next 4 years. And if, in fact, we can get Trump back in office, well, then he'll have some allies to get things done, which is also important. So at any rate, stay in the fight. That's the way to go. And at any rate, I'll call this video to a close now. If you like them, please subscribe to my YouTube channel if you have access to an account there, and give me a like. Comments are appreciated, and I have answered a few that I've gotten, and so I'll also try to attach a link to a video which shows evidence of the voter fraud in Wisconsin. It was done with some statistical analysis that's often used in these kind of issues. So all for now.